Thanks for joining me. My name is Bruce Levinson, and I work here at Anthem, New York, looking after brand strategy. And what we do here is we turn consumer insights into brand selling propositions and then bring them to life through brilliant design. Today we're going to be talking about the Millennial generation with a presentation entitled The Great Baton Pass. And the reason we've called it the Great Baton Pass is there really is a transition from an older generation, primarily baby boomers, into a younger one. And there are implications for brand marketers and brand owners, and presumably that's why you are here today. So I think what we'll do is we'll just get started into the presentation. I've got some slides to share, and we'll also leave some time for questions at the end. So with that, we will go right ahead. There's been a lot of talk about millennials. It really is the next great generation of American consumers. And I think what's interesting about millennials is while today they don't have the purchasing power that some older groups do, they're having an enormous amount of influence and impact on the way that brands are perceived and bought in the market. So a lot of forward-looking companies are really trying to understand a little bit more about these consumers and whether they're different, and they are different, and not just a younger version of the older consumers that they're buying their products today. We're going to be looking at attitudes, behaviors, and some trends. And the reason why it's important for us to do that is that successful brands over time, and I've got a few examples on the screen here, have been able to attract a consumer, and even as that consumer ages and they become an older consumer base, still remain relevant to a younger audience as well. But they do that by reinventing themselves, by staying fresh, by really understanding the consumer that's emerging. And to illustrate that point, I wanted to share with you just a data point, a piece of research that we embarked here at Anthem with Lab 42, one of our consumer research partners. And we asked millennials about brands that they buy or brands that they like that their parents would never buy. We also asked about brands that their parents liked that they would never buy. And the answers were maybe not shocking, but a little bit surprising, that in the world of apparel, automotive, footwear, and other categories, there were some stark differences. And I think this is a data point. It's not the be-all, end-all. So if you're managing one of these brands and you're at the top of the page, don't pop a champagne cork just yet. Or if you're on the bottom page, it's not time to run for the hills. But I think it is telling that there are some meaningful differences between brands and the way that they're connecting emotionally with consumers that are younger. It's incredibly important. And I want to share with you one example that it goes back a number of years, but it's kind of a recipe for what not to do. If there are any millennials out there who don't know, Oldsmobile was a very large car company owned by General Motors. And in the 1980s and early 90s, they had a real problem. They had a user base, a consumer base, which was aging, and they were not appealing to the younger audience that they really needed to start to penetrate. So they arrived at a strategy like this, which is an ad that said, "This is not your father's Oldsmobile." Very transparent strategy, but it failed for a number of reasons. I mean, the two big ones are, number one, they ended up offending their core users, those fathers in the ad, who liked the brand. And they also didn't do anything to change the product or the tone to appeal to a younger generation and indicate that anything was different. So let's not do that. Let's take a few minutes and understand a little bit more about what makes this consumer tick and how brands can really create an emotional connection with them that's going to resonate and ultimately drive sales. So it all starts with a reference point, and I think it's worth just taking a step back and looking at the cultural reference points across different generations. The first is, obviously, every generation has its heroes, its defining moments, even its brands. You look at baby boomers and free love and Vietnam protests, land on the moon. Then this group becomes successful yuppies and they're swilling down European vodka. Gen Xers, from the fall of communism to many pop cultural references. And you see, millennials, who in many ways are a much more diverse group culturally, with a tremendous number of influences. This was the group that, remember those baby on board signs in the back of minivans? They were those babies. They were driven around by soccer moms, and they grew up, they voted in their first presidential election 4 years ago and saw Barack Obama take office. They've been part and parcel to imports like Harry Potter and a whole range of other social and geopolitical issues, even most recently. So it just gives us a little bit of a sense of where they're coming from. But I think it's actually really important to look at some of the differences between how the older generation and the younger generations look at millennials themselves. So I've taken this slide that I'm showing now from the Boston Consulting Group. They wrote a paper which I thought was really interesting because it evaluated the way that US millennials view themselves and compared that to the way that non-millennials viewed millennials. And what you see is there are some commonalities. Somebody pointed out that lazy was actually coming through very clearly on both groups. But you see that millennials are saying, look, we're tech savvy, we're hip, we're young, we're cool, we're innovative. Whereas non-millennials were saying they're young, yeah, but entitled, spoiled, selfish. So whether that's truth or fiction, whether it's a stereotype or not, I think that this page helps to illustrate the perceptual gulf between the way that the younger generation and the older generation view the perceptions around millennials themselves. And the reason that that's important is that non-millennials, baby boomers, Gen Xers, are many of us who are either managing brands or running companies that are either selling products to millennials or selling products to millennials and hiring millennials. So we've got to get on a little bit more common ground. And that starts with a better understanding of who these people are and what they're all about. So that's what we're going to try to do today. We've summarized some thoughts into 6 key themes. And these are broad. We're talking about a group of people anywhere from 18 to about 32. It's not quite a quarter of the US population numerically, so it's a big group. So these are generalizations, but what I've tried to do is to pull out some of the things that make this group distinct and different. So a couple of thoughts. Let's start with the first one, which is diversity and equality. US millennials are the most ethnically diverse, culturally diverse, and conceptually tolerant generation in American history. They have grown up in a world of cultural change. They've seen the first African American president. They've seen states exert the influence and the power to allow same-sex marriages. They've seen the rise of multicultural, multiracial, and international pop stars and cultural icons. And they've seen tons of imports from other countries that are influencing pop culture. And as a result, they have the most open-mindedness of any generation that we've seen. And that is a stark difference. We'll dig into this in a bit more detail. So how are some brands dealing with this openness and this diversity? On a very fundamental level, on a very simplistic level, you see somebody like Cheerios who's recognizing the fact that Hispanics are now 16% of the US population. A lot of them are young, and they're introducing flavors which cater to that audience. But in addition, you see L'Oreal, who's chosen Frida Pinto to be the face of their brand. It's a darker skin tone than they're used to. It's a little bit more inclusive of different types of people and different types of skin. But I think what's even more interesting is when brands go beyond that kind of functional attribute into more perceptual ideas. And you start to see brands that are appealing to more diverse sensibilities. So Kenneth Cole, and this is a brand which has often pushed the limits in terms of their communication, has a billboard which has a point of view about gay marriage. And it says, gay people getting married, next they'll be allowed to vote and pay taxes. So, they're being part of this conversation, and with their message denouncing an intolerance. And that is part and parcel, no matter what you believe about this subject. It is helping them to connect with an audience and a generation of people that feel it a similar way. I want to contrast that to the image on the lower right-hand page, which is Chick-Fil-A, the fast food chain, that earlier this year was surrounded by protests because of their stance on gay marriage. And again, it's not whether you're for it or against it or whatever your point of view is, but it is important to know that a recipe for driving brands and appealing to younger generations has got to be more inclusive and really not intolerant. So those are just a couple of examples of what's going on in the world in 2012. I want to move on to another theme, which is trading down. This is a consumer that has been entering the job market in the midst of a recession, one of the worst recessions we've had in American history. And it's a tough market. They're also younger than a lot of the other generations in the workforce. So as a result, their take-home pay, their discretionary income is lower. And you see it on this chart. This comes from just the U.S. Census data, but then below it is a fact that Anthem and Ipsos joined on a piece of research, and what we found was 15 possible factors indicating why a millennial would choose the brands that they do. The number one factor is good value for the money. So it just reinforces this need for value, particularly for millennials today. But it goes further. And I wanted to share this chart because I think it's actually a little bit more surprising. More so than baby boomers. You're seeing millennials agreeing with the statement, I don't focus on brands, I focus on the lowest price. 21% strongly agree versus 13% baby boomers. 41% agree versus 13% baby boomers. This coming from a Jeffries and Alex Partners study. And I think what that really demonstrates is brands have got to change the conversation from an item at a price to connecting at an emotional level. Or else the only winners in this world are going to be Walmart and the dollar stores and maybe some discount chains. So it just, keep that in mind as we start to think about how to connect with this consumer, and it will set up a lot of what else is going on and the way that brands are acting in the marketplace. The third theme we want to talk about is trading up. So it's not all just doom and gloom. There is a role for trading up and luxury in the world of millennial spending, but it's a different kind of luxury. It's not a boomer kind of luxury. So where baby boomers were very much about exclusivity, about obtaining something which was a piece of another world, and you look at Chanel No. 5 as an example, millennials are much more about either something which has intrinsic value, that makes the world easier or is convenient or provides a practical solution for them. So they still want something which is fashionable. It's a Burberry trench coat in this case, but it also is something that they can use, that they can wear, that has intrinsic value, perhaps more than perfume. The other thing that millennials will spend money on, and this is perhaps the number one expenditure, are gadgets. And it's not always to the health of their checkbook. We look and see 29% of millennials surveyed agreed with the statement, I will sometimes buy luxury items I cannot afford to keep up to date. For any millennials out there, you may know what you're looking at is the new iPad mini. And I'm guessing that before too long there'll be a line around the block outside of the Apple store to get this. And just you think about that number, whereas Generation X and baby boomers were much lower, there is this opportunity to trade up, but again, it's got to provide some sort of functional benefit, and they certainly see that through technology. But trading up is more than just obtaining something physical. It's also about experiences, very much so, about experiences rather than material goods. And you see that with food. I wanted to point to this quote from Denise Morrison from Campbell's, who said, "Millennials have a taste for culinary adventure and variety." And I think more than every other generation, millennials have grown up in a world where sushi is at now the drugstore, the airport, the ballpark. It's like pizza. It's just part of the American cuisine experience. And so brands, particularly food brands, have got to continue to feed the sense for culinary adventure, excitement, and something new. And that is something that millennials will spend money on. I'll show you one example of the way that Campbell's has, one way that Campbell's is looking to do this is through their Go Soup line. So if you haven't seen it before, it's these pouches with very campy graphics and really interesting flavors like golden lentil with Madras curry, clearly catering to a slightly more foodie and gourmet palate, which has become much more mainstream. But you also see it's in a pouch, it's microwavable, there's an aspect of convenience there. And even though this franchise was built on that iconic red and white can, they've decided to move away. This is not their father's tomato soup. This is something new. And they really, they're doing it, they're demonstrating it in a very real way. The other thing that I think is interesting about this product is that the retail price is considerably higher than the traditional soups and cans. So when there's value, when you're tapping into this trend, they will trade up and they will buy something, but that value has to be there. And that leads me to theme number 4. And we're talking about the greater good. There's been a lot published about millennials, and they are incredibly active. They are more responsive to cause marketing. We've seen that data, and it's confirmed by Anthem data as well. But I think it's important to understand it a little bit more. The first is they're an optimistic audience, very much a glass half full. Millennials believe that they are empowered to drive positive change in the world. They believe that through the power of their social network, they can accelerate good in the world, or they can shed light and transparency on something negative. They have seen the power in their collective voice, and they're very, very optimistic, and they believe that through their collective actions, they can drive change. And you see that in a number of areas. And I want to show you some data, which again comes from an Anthem study that we did with Ipsos earlier this year, to really understand some of the differences between millennials' attitudes and the older generations. So a few facts, kind of a busy slide, but it's important to look into it. 58% of millennials feel that a brand that makes me feel like a good person is very important or important, significantly more than the older groups. 69% agree a brand that acts responsibly in the way they do business is very important or important, second only to offering good value, which we've seen. And finally, they also were more than twice as likely as boomers to agree with the statement, when I choose to buy a brand, it's like voting for that company's values. So I don't want to say that they're rose-tinted kind of do-gooders, but it is absolutely part and parcel of who defines them and how they make choices in the store when they're looking for brands. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of brands that have really got this recipe well worked. And these are the ones where social responsibility is part and parcel. It is intrinsically linked with the brand proposition. So Ben and Jerry's, they put their message out there, and when they buy, whether it's fair trade cocoa or fair trade coffee or responsibly grown ingredients, that is part and parcel of the product and its embodiment of the brand itself. They're not saying, buy my ice cream and I'll go plant some trees somewhere. Tom's, I think, is a fantastic example and a very, very clear proposition. Right? For those of you who don't know, if you buy a pair of Tom's shoes, you get one, and then they give one to a child who needs a pair of shoes. They call it the one-for-one program, and that's incredibly. It's an incredibly simple story. It's a concise story. It's a motivating story, and increasingly these stories are what gets talked about and what gets propagated through social media. Now there is a flip side to some of this social responsibility. And none of the brands on this page are guilty of it, but there are brands we probably can all think of that maybe thinking about millennials as in this way, and they take a somewhat disingenuous approach, a somewhat cynical approach, and maybe it's an Earth Day promotion one month, 6 months later it's a breast cancer tie-in, and it just feels like they're kind of chasing something. And millennials, perhaps more than other generations, will see through that, and if you're not careful, it can really turn them off. So you want to make sure if you're doing this, you do it in a 100% very genuine, very transparent way, and where you can, enlist them and help them to propagate your message. So that leads me to the way that those messages get propagated, and that's this aspect of being always connected. Millennials, more than any other generation, are known for being digital natives. Now, all of us are using technology. If you're even on this webcast, this video conference, you are using digital technology. But there's a difference. It's the difference between learning French from a textbook and growing up in France. The millennials grew up with computers, with technology. It is second nature to them. And as a result, they use it much more than we do. I say we, I'm clearly not a millennial, but they use it much more than older generations. Just a fun fact on this slide, there was some Pew research which suggested that 83% of millennials had their cell phone within arm's reach while sleeping. Their phone is very much their alarm clock, and it is their lifeline to their entire community. But what I want to talk to you about on this subject is how digital and mobile technology is impacting everything. The way that they approach brands and purchasing brands and talk about brands. So mobile really has the opportunity and is enabled to create demand through exposures and advertising and brand communication, offering guidance, advice, maybe helping them to navigate, choose, select a product. Certainly there's price comparisons. We've seen showrooming and other ways to look at transferable demand. Obviously they can purchase online increasingly as Amazon grows bigger and bigger, and then converting a satisfactory experience after they've used it into some sort of advocacy. So it's the zero moment of truth, the first moment of truth, and then the second moment of truth, all in the palm of their hands. So what is that really impacting? Well, one thing is, the way that they approach grocery shopping is different. Millennials buy about 9% less than baby boomers of their groceries at traditional grocery stores. So they're much more likely to buy products online and have it delivered at home. They're much more likely to comparison shop, to go online, look at product reviews. If they have a good experience with diapers.com, well, what do? They'll go to soap.com, part of the same company, the next time. And so we've really got to think through about how we harness this technology and how we win that sale, depending on where you are in this group, to win them over. And I want to highlight one company, a retailer, that I think is well informed and is taking some steps towards winning over millennials. Clearly a lot more to do, but I really think that it's important to test, it's important to understand, and when things are working, to double down. So what has Safeway done? Safeway, first of all, they've got store apps, so you can get customized offers with a Just For You program, which, depending on your purchase history and the way that you shop, you're going to get a specific offer tailored to your needs. There's Safeway.com, where you can buy products and have it delivered to your house. There's online information to help you figure out what it is you really need, whether it's around health and wellness or nutrition. And finally, it's about a product assortment which is in keeping with millennials' tastes. So there are companies who are taking this and they're leading in this space, and it's important to continue to test in this area. One of the things that makes it incredibly important now is the whole aspect of peer reviews. So whether it's somebody's liking on Facebook or in a specific retail environment like drugstore.com, product reviews it's kind of a virtuous cycle. I mean, from one sense, millennials are more likely to be uploading their reviews, their information, to be posting their feedback, and they're also more likely to be receiving that feedback as part of their purchase influence. So, they're actually having more of an influence over the retail scene and over brands than just their purchasing power and how much they spend in the store by itself. And then the last thing, which is related to this, and the way that they share information and talk about it, even something as mundane as a bar of soap, is this whole aspect of the way that brands communicate. So probably the busiest slide that I've got to share you today, but I think it's an important one. And the old dialogue used to be this broadcast media from brand to a group of consumers with a message. And we know that that world still exists to some degree, but it's really changed to a brand speaking to consumers having the opportunity to speak back and share their opinions and their perspective, but also consumers speaking to consumers. So you have this kind of three-way dialogue. And in fact, it's no longer about share of voice, it's about share of conversations, that social discourse about your brand, which is not owned by the brand. It might be moderated or curated or mediated by the brand, but it's actually owned by the consumer itself. And that's a fundamental difference with the way that consumers are interacting with brands today. The last theme that I want to cover is instant gratification. Instant gratification is really about a culture of immediacy. If you think about even something as profound as photography, moving from film cameras and dropping off your film and picking it up later to digital cameras and then bringing them back to your computer and uploading it through a hard wire, to today you've got Instagram, and literally from a moving vehicle you can take a picture, manipulate it, and share it with your entire network around the world instantly. It's a completely different mindset around access, convenience anytime, making it easy, and having it right now. And that has an influence on not just digital uploads or downloads, but it's everything from why Amazon and now Walmart are doing same-day delivery for certain items, because there is this need to have it right now. The other thing that it forms is somewhat of a dislocation of conventions. Something like Kickstarter or any of the crowdfunding sites, in some ways bypass the traditional ways of starting a business, because there's a faster way, there's an easier way, there's something to it which you can use the power of your network. If you have a great idea, you don't have to do it in the kind of conventional sense. And what that does is it gives rise to the dreams of a generation, so that you can become a cultural icon, a billionaire businessman like Zuck here. And obviously this is an extreme case, but I think it does trickle down to a certain degree in terms of how millennials view the jobs that they have when they have them, their expectations. And it really is, it's not a sense of lazy or entitled, like I think we saw in that earlier slide. It's a culture of maybe impatience, a sense of having it right now. So I think that gives you a little bit of a flavor of millennials today and some of the things that are defining them, which are really different from earlier generations. Just in a summary slide, we've talked about them being the next great generation. Again, almost a quarter of the population already. They have a tremendous influence over brands and marketing, and they haven't even hit their peak earning years. So just wait for the future. There's a need for value. There's a need for convenience. They will trade up for positive experiences, adventure, and certainly gadgets. That's something that's very useful and practical in their life. And they also want to do the right thing. They really believe that they can create change in the world. And then the last thing, and this may be even the most important, is this is a consumer that's engaged in dialogue when they choose, on their terms, if it matters to them. So the first thing is for brands to start listening, if you're not. And then the second thing, obviously, is to engage in that discourse and drive an emotional connection with them. And I'll leave you with one final thought, which is the Surgeon General's warning. We've talked about millennials really from a demographic standpoint and then made some generalizations. Obviously, there are segments within millennials, and demographics only take you so far. So I think all of us should use this as a way to spark some thoughts, maybe challenge some assumptions, maybe develop a new strategy. And if that excites you, I'd be happy to join you on that journey. That's what I have to present to you today. I'd like to open it now for a few minutes for some questions, and I think you can type them right down in the box on the bottom of your screen. So, who wants to ask the first question? I'm sure they're out there. So a question has come in: millennials are shopping less in traditional grocery stores. Is that all due to buying groceries online? So I think that's actually a great question. There's no doubt that I think the slide said that baby boomers shop about 50% in traditional grocery stores, and millennials are shopping about 41%. But the difference isn't just online. It is a big part of that. But the other thing, and this is interesting, is that millennials are also twice as likely to shop in convenience stores than the other older generations. And I think that's interesting because we know that they have less money, and convenience stores typically have higher prices, but it just goes to show you how important convenience is. But yes, I would imagine that over time, that number, if we did that survey again next year or in 2 years' time, 41 becomes 30-something. It certainly appears to be a trend. I'm going to skip down to another question. So Jennifer asks, you mentioned some brands that are not connecting with millennials today. What can they do to become more relevant? Well, I think that's a good question, Jennifer. Thanks for asking it. Well, there's two things. I mean, the first is, I think, to understand why a brand isn't connecting. So when we started the presentation, we talked about a couple of brands that weren't resonating. And that could be for a couple of reasons, right? It could be because millennials aren't aware of the brand, and for many years they've been advertising to a different audience, and they've got to create awareness. Or it could be that there's awareness, and they actually have to create relevance because the benefits of the brand, the proposition of the brand, isn't speaking to the values of the younger audience. So I think I would ask that question back and say, what is it that we know about this, and then how can we then address it? Just looking for one or two other questions. Can you speak to the sharing economy and how that fits in with millennials? This is a question from Susan. Well, thank you. I think what you mean about the sharing economy, and please type if it's not what you mean, it has to do with shared ownership. So there are a number of instances where millennials are opting for communal ownership of something. In the most kind of basic sense, it's sharing music. But I think even now you look at the rise of something like Zipcar, where instead of renting a car for the whole day or for a weekend, you just need it for an hour or two. And this plays into the mindset of, being, getting what you need, but not more. But also this pervasiveness that you don't need to own as much stuff. Millennials didn't grow up with an enormous music collection, or maybe they did, but they certainly don't have one now, or movies for that matter. They're used to streaming this and not owning as much stuff. So there is this aspect of kind of communal living, if you will. I'm sure some psychologists might read into it, but it could have been from all of those soccer teams that they were on when they were younger, and this aspect of group, everything was done in groups, from carpools to team sports, so on and so forth. Much more inclusive than individualistic. In fact, I think many millennials grew up on teams where whether you won or whether you lost, everybody got a trophy. Just reading down to tackle one or two other questions while we still have a few minutes. So the question, here's an interesting question from Guy in Canada. Do you think that in the late 60s, the young people of that age group had the same values that we've described today? And I think it's a great question. I can't speak with authority about what young people were feeling in the 1960s, but I will take a shot at it. And I think the 60s came, particularly the late 60s, came in an era of, just after an intense amount of conservatism. People were conservative. And there was more of a backlash and an uprising with an enormous group of young people that did not want to stand for the older generation's values. It was very much about rebellion. And I think one of the differences between millennials today is they don't hate their parents. They're friends with their parents. And they respect, in many ways, the world that they're coming into. However, they know it can be a better world. And they feel like they are empowered to change it. And I think there are some parallels in the need for change. But it's a much less angry change. And I think it's a softer and much more global change as well. I hope that answers your question, Guy. Maybe we'll take one or two more questions. And I can also look back if there are some specific other questions. Be happy to answer them offline from email or whatever else. So here's a question from Amy. What social media do millennials use most frequently? It's a great question. And actually, I just saw something on this recently, which was very interesting, which was, I wish I remember the source. The older millennials were more likely to spend time on Facebook, particularly moms. Moms are involved in lots of gaming as well. Younger millennials, and we're talking about older teenagers at this point into college, were less likely to use Facebook and more likely to use Twitter. And the interesting thing was, because Twitter was more anonymous, and their parents might not be seeing who they're connected to and what they're saying and doing, which I thought was kind of an interesting one. Also for moms, Pinterest, I think in the last 6 to 12 months has really taken off, particularly for moms as a way to, and probably for brands to really drive connections between products and brands and things and experiences that they want to share. So I think we'll take one more question. So there's a question from Heidi that says, how important is packaging to millennials' overall perception of a product convenience and a product's convenience and social conscience? So that's a great question. Well, there's no doubt that packaging has always been incredibly important and still is incredibly important. If you think about a world of fragmented media, and you think about how many messages are competing for the consumer or the shopper's attention, the one thing that's always on, the one thing that when they go into a store, even if they're buying online, that is leaving an impression on them when they're at the point of decision to purchase, is that packaging. The role of packaging may very well be changing, because the things that millennial consumers are looking for particularly in some categories over others, may be different than the older generation. We looked at Go Soup, where that packaging is microwavable. Somebody else might look at sustainable packaging. These add either convenience or social conscience, where perhaps for baby boomers it was less important. So there's no doubt that packaging remains incredibly critical and potentially even more so than before. Well, I think we've covered a lot of questions. If you have further ones, please feel free to reach out. You see my email address on the screen. Thanks very much for joining me and spending the time today. And good luck connecting with those millennials. Take care, everyone.